Car-centric cities have become a defining feature of the American landscape, and their dominance continues to shape how we all move and live. As these cities expand, so do the challenges of traffic, pollution, and exclusion. Today, on Gulf Streams, we're continuing our exploration into urban transportation, discussing the challenges that car-centric cities pose and the critical role of inclusive transportation planning. We'll delve into how Houston can incorporate more equitable transportation options and what can be done to ensure future transportation systems are equitable and accessible to all. I'm Sienna Yiin.
And I'm Jadyn Bray-Boyce.
And we're both students at Rice University and researchers on Gulf Streams. You're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode.
Before we jump into our conversation, I want to remind you that KPFT Houston is currently in our May Fund Drive. As public radio, KPFT Houston can only exist with your support. Over 90% of our funding comes from listeners like you. If you're enjoying Gulf Streams and want to support our work, please call 713-526-KPFT and pledge a donation. You can make a one-time donation or become a monthly sustainer to support our work. In the coming weeks, Gulf Streams will feature conversations with experts on greenwashing, urban sprawl, and coal pollution. If you want to become a station sustainer, ask about our memory bricks, permanent inscribed tributes to your generosity here at the studio. Call 713-526-KPFT to learn about all the unique pledge drive offerings going on this month. We're delighted to bring you important conversations about environmental and climate issues here in Houston and beyond on Gulf Streams, and can only do so with your support. So please, call 713-526-KPFT. Make a one-time or subscriber donation, mention Gulf Streams, and help us keep ad-free public radio on the air here in Houston.
So today we're talking to two transportation and urban planning experts, Veronica Davis and Christof Spieler. Veronica is the author of the book Inclusive Transportation, a Manifesto for Repairing Divided Communities, and is the current National Director of Cities Program for the engineering firm Actus Realis. She's also the former Director of Transportation and Drainage Operations for the City of Houston. Christof Spieler is the Director of Planning at Hewitt-Zollars in Houston and is the former Houston Metro Board member, helping to redesign the Houston bus network. He is also author of the book Trains, Buses, and People, and is a senior lecturer at Rice University on transportation. So welcome, Ms. Davis and Dr. Spieler.
Thank you for having us.
Happy to be here.
Thanks for joining. So we'll start off with a very easy question. So what inspired both of you to pick a career in transportation?
I'm happy to go first. I joke that I was born into it. The career picked me. My mom went into labor outside of USDOT's headquarters in 1979. And that is, I was born in Virginia, but that's where my mom went into labor. So I joke I was born into it. My dad was a civil engineer and urban planner. And so he worked for Urban Mass Transit Administration, now the Federal Transit Administration, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, CSX, and then ended his career at American Society of Civil Engineers. My mom went for New York City Transit Authority, and there was no getting away from it. So that is how I really got into it. My days off from school, I was with one of my parents at their places of work, and that is really how I got into it. I tried to run away from it, but I had a professor when I was a junior in undergrad, Professor Sermons, and he really got me excited and interested in transportation planning, transportation engineering. That's why I decided to get a master's in planning, and the rest, they say, is history.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a little bit of transportation in my family too. My grandfather was a railroad station master, but for me, I didn't think this was going to be my career. I got bachelor's and master's degrees in civil engineering, which taught me how to be a structural engineer. And I went out of school as a structural engineer and actually spent the first 9 years of my career making buildings stand up, which I had tremendous fun doing. But meanwhile, in my spare time, I'd taken an amazing transportation class at Rice from John Sedlak, who was a Houston Metro at the time, and he was talking about this light rail line Houston was going to build. And I thought that was interesting. And also got involved while I was in grad school in Site Magazine, started writing about transportation in Houston for Site, which got me involved in transportation advocacy, which got me writing a blog, which got me working with neighborhood groups on, we want a rail line in our neighborhood and projects like that. And all of that advocacy work on the side then ended up with me being appointed to the Metro board, but also ended up with me getting an offer from a firm that was trying to do urban planning. And so I switched over to Morris Architects, which is now Hewitt Zollers. And the thing I was doing in my spare time actually turned into my career.
And Jadyn and I we're actually in your class this semester. And I think that's kind of what interested us in learning more about transportation as well, and diving more deeply into this topic and interviewing both of you guys. And so we're going to jump right into this question. What is it about car-centric cities that make them not inclusive to all of their residents? What are kind of the key challenges that these car-centric cities pose for non-car users?
Do you want to go first, Christof?
Oh, there's so much to say on that. I mean, I think one thing I'll just start with is geometry. I think the way we actually structure our civil engineering class is around geometry, that every mode of transportation comes with an inherent geometry. So if you're going to design a city for cars, you have to design it for the speed of cars, you have to design it for the turning radii of cars, and most of all, you have to design it for the space that cars take up. And one way I think about this a lot is that if you have a cubicle in an office building, your car in the parking garage is actually assigned more space than you are. Cars just simply need a lot of room, whether they are moving or whether they are sitting still. And so as soon as we design a city for cars, we have to take a huge chunk of that city and give it over to cars. And that means that everything moves further apart. That means that we can fit less stuff into every block of that city. And if you are not driving, that means you're going to need to walk further to everything you want to get to. If you're using transit, it means that transit route is going to have lower ridership because there's simply less stuff around every station. And because it has lower ridership, it's going to come less often. So you're going to have to wait longer. And so when we decide to make a city car-centric, we are inherently deciding to make it harder to walk, bike, and take transit in that city. So I think that's one part of that answer. But there's also a whole layer of equity around this. I think Veronica's very eager to chime in on.
Yeah, I'll say that there's two pieces that make it inequitable. So one on the housing side, as Christof mentioned, when you have cars, you have to build space for them. I especially see this more on the East Coast where they build underground parking. And so for every underground parking space, it's $50,000 to $100,000 for every underground parking space. And so it makes that housing more expensive overall to recoup the cost that it took to build all of the underground parking. But that could have made the housing more affordable if you don't build parking. And there are examples of cities where at transit stations, they are not building any parking. And it's for that reason, to make it more affordable overall for that particular apartment building for people to live there. If you think at the personal level, cars are very expensive. One, you have to own the car. So even if you are leasing, even if you have a payment plan, interest rates right now for cars, I mean, even with good credit, you're probably still at 10%, 11% interest. So you're paying significantly more for the car. Even the used car market is extremely expensive to own. Then once you own it, you have to put gas in it, you have to maintain it, you have to register and all of those things. So it is extremely expensive on the individual to have to own a car in order to get around. And so when we look at our car-centric cities, we can see that the affordability is largely because of the automobile. And then when you think about the public health side of it, that's a separate cost. You look at childhood asthma, wider roads, highways, you tend to see higher childhood asthma. When you've created communities that are inhabitable for walking, you see higher obesity rates and all of these other things. So to me, a car-centric city is a inherently unhealthy and unaffordable city.
Well, and I would add to that that this isn't the question we're answering here isn't should there be cars in cities, because I do think there are things that cars do incredibly well. And some of the most walkable, transit-friendly most bikeable cities on Earth still have cars in them. And for example, if we want to do deliveries, that's actually something that vehicles do incredibly well. Um, and part of, to me, what's actually interesting about this is if you make a city that is better for walking and biking and transit and make more people actually choose those modes, you're actually making the car end of things operate better as well. And those things that happen to happen in cars, like those ambulances that are responding to somebody who is having a heart attack, can actually work better as well if we're not clogging our cars our streets full of the cars of people who are doing things that they could be doing on foot or on bike or on transit if we gave them those options.
Yeah, so I'm going to add on to that. We're going to pile on this. Really to Christof's point, when we think about Amsterdam, we think about biking, right? That is what we think of. And I have a really great photo that I share in a lot of my talks, that it really is a complete street. And it's a photo that has a really wide sidewalk for people to drive. It has really great bike infrastructure for people to bike. There's really great transit in the middle of the street. And then there's still space for people to drive, both parking and also being able to operate a vehicle. So it is not about being anti-car. To Christof's point, it's really about giving people as many options as possible so that they can drive when they really need to drive, but really being able to move and navigate a city with as many options as possible.
And I want to get to the equity side of this. You were saying that car-centric cities do create inequities, and in your book, you have a critique of the popular equity illustration, which is where the one with people of different heights trying to watch a baseball game, where the short person has a box to stand on, but the tall person doesn't. So I'd love to hear more about what equity means to you and why you tackle this very popular definition of equity, because I know you don't define it explicitly, but you tackle it in your book.
Well, I think that everyone will say, equality is everyone gets the same, and equity is everyone get what they need. But the problem is we cannot meet the needs of our citizens. I think that if you look at any city, any community, the needs exceed the resources available. You have only but so much staff time. You only have but so much funding. You only have but so much consultant capacity available to you to meet the needs of the community. And infrastructure is largely has been underinvested in for what we've created. And this is not unique to Houston. It's really a nationwide problem. I'd even say it's probably a global challenge of we haven't maintained our infrastructure because buried infrastructure is unseen. And because it's unseen, we don't think about it until we are impacted by it. And the same thing with, even driving, we don't think about our transportation until we are impacted by something that is impeding our ability to move. And so with that, it is really, to me, about prioritization. We have to prioritize where there is the greatest need of all. And I will say, working in, I'll give, a tale of two communities. Working in Houston under Mayor Turner, he had the complete communities, and that is 10 communities that were identified to have the highest need in our city, and that there has been no investment in these communities at all. And so working with those communities, they developed their action plan. And as departments, we were to look at what was on the action plan and prioritize that level of investment. And when I think about my time at the city and I think about where we did invest, we were able to rehab a lot of the roads in those communities. We were able to do a lot of drainage projects in those communities. And many of the millions and millions of dollars that we brought in from the federal government will go to benefit those communities and even connect those communities. And to me, that is what equity is. In the book, I talk about Montgomery County, Maryland, and that was where they developed this framework. We developed a framework of an emergency room of everyone will get served. However, those that have the highest need or those that have the immediate need will get served first and stabilized. and then, everyone eventually will get served. And so we have to think about our cities that way. We will eventually, repair all the roads and do all these things, but it is about how we prioritize. And then when we think back to the original question that you asked about car-centric cities, cars need more lanes. And so the more lanes that you have, that is more to maintain. And so as we think and, cities really look at paradigm shifts to other modes, the more you can reallocate space to other uses, you're actually reducing what you have to maintain over time, because, vehicles do beat up roads, trucks beat up roads and all of those things. And so you are actually reducing your maintenance costs over time by doing these type of implementation. But to me, that is what equity is. It's about prioritizing those with the most need.
Yeah. No, and it's not everybody can drive. Some people can't afford a car. Some people are not physically able to drive. Some people are not old enough yet to have a driver's license and want to get around the city anyway. And I think we sometimes don't think about those individual financial burdens that cars put on people. I think there's a lot of people who own cars but can't afford them, who are basically one busted transmission away from having no way to get around the city. And that literally, you don't have transit service they can take instead, or don't give them the ability to bike instead. That busted transmission means they lose their job. And then they lose their job, and then they don't have money to make their rent payments. And then they're like, there is something very precarious about relying on a beat up used car, which is the best thing you can afford, that you can just barely afford to try to make it through the world. And I think that is one of the things that cities ought to offer, is that backup, that you have another way to get around. And I think that's what makes, for example, one of the things that's great in New York City is everybody takes the subway, because the subway is the best way to get around. And the people who have lots of money and the people who have very little money both have the same access to the city. And I think that's a wonderfully equitable thing that transit can create for us.
So I'd love to kind of take this as a jump off point. So how do you suppose that cities like Houston or other cities relatively similar to Houston would create or prioritize equitable transportation solutions? And then going further than that, what would you say are the first steps that need to be taken?
I'd say one first step is to think about all the new projects we're doing and say that every new thing we build should take us towards a path of being a more equitable and more multimodal city, rather than take us away from that. And to me, part of that is every project should try to do multiple things. I don't think we should build projects that are only transit projects. They should also be pedestrian projects. They should also be bike projects, because how are people going to get to those transit stops if they can't walk there? I also don't think we should be building projects that are only car projects. Every time we're doing a major reconstruction in some corridor, what can we do to make transit work better in that corridor? What can we do to create more pedestrian and bike connections across that corridor? So I think step one is look at all of our future plans and say, are these taking us in the right direction?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I'll even say that during my time at the city of Houston, we even looked at just rehab projects. So under the Americans with Disability Act, if you are doing a rehab, even let's say asphalt overlay, you are supposed to upgrade the curb ramps, but that's it. There's no conversation about sidewalks. But we did take the opportunity anytime we were doing rehab of a roadway to go ahead and make repairs to the sidewalks, even though by ordinance, they're the abutting property owner's responsibility. But doing that time to close any gaps that we had, as well as any tripping hazards. And so a really great example is Ennis, which is right by Texas Southern University. That is a long corridor that we recently just did a mill and overlay, as well as fixing about 3,500 linear feet of sidewalk. So to me, that is an example of multi-solving, as really Christof is talking about. When I look at the drainage side, especially in cities like Houston, I know that there's several Florida cities, Louisiana cities that are in the same boat, where it's a very flat city. You have clay soil, which is, it might as well be plastic soil, in terms of the drainage of it all. So being creative. And so one of the projects that we did in Third Ward around Zuri Malone Park was it's actually a drainage project where we use the sidewalks as part of the drainage system and then put pervious pavers on top of this to facilitate the sidewalk. So you have an improved mobility, but really it was a drainage project of where can we hold water because it's so flat, we can't get it to the outfall. So how can we just hold water to prevent flooding? And so that is just an example of being creative, multi-solving, a drainage project leading the conversation that then becomes a mobility project. We did something similar in Acres Homes. And then even on the, kind of standard sidewalk side, we had a drainage project in the northeast part of the city where we installed a new stormwater pipe. But at that time, we also gave that community brand new sidewalks on both sides. So it's one of those things of, adding on to something that's already happening, because incrementally, the cost of a sidewalk is a lot cheaper as part of a bigger project, be it rehab or be it reconstruction, than if you go do a sidewalk project alone. And sidewalk projects are single-handedly the hardest projects to do in any city. They're extremely expensive when you do them on their own, but when you can do it as part of a project. But I think to the bigger question, I serve on the U.S. Department of Transportation Advisory Committee on Transportation Equity, and we've been grappling with a lot of these things. And I chair the interventions subcommittee with Secretary Millar from Washington Department of Transportation. And I really think where the federal government can help move some of these better projects, it really comes down to how funding flows from the federal government to the states, to the regional planning organizations, and eventually to the cities. And so I think with the bipartisan infrastructure law, what gives me a lot of hope, it's the amount of money that is going directly to cities, directly to transit agencies, so that you can have a better holistic project. But then in addition, it's what can the federal government do to help make transit projects look better? Because if you just think about the benefit cost analysis for a transit project, you have to do a benefit cost analysis, you have to do an operations plan, you have to do a financial plan, you have to do a ridership plan. The bar is so high to do a transit project, but on a highway, where's the bar? So how do we raise the bar for highway projects that the benefit can be more than just, we're going to move more vehicles? How do we actually raise the bar for how we evaluate highway projects to be at that same level of a transit project so that we can just get better overall projects? So that's some of the stuff that we've been grappling with this committee, particularly as the next highway bill will be coming up soon. The new reauthorization will be coming up in, I think, another year or two. So being able to think about these things of how can the funding from the federal government encourage better multimodal projects.
No, and I think that's also one of the things that it's always worth looking at funding, because it sort of builds a whole set of incentives in. And for example, the federal government pays a much larger share of highway projects than it does of transit projects, which is essentially incentivizing states and cities to build highways instead of transit. And then there's other things we don't fund at all. Like, I wish we spent a lot more money on freight rail. We are seeing a lot of the impacts of the fact that we have a very antiquated freight rail system that neighborhoods in cities are suffering from every day. And part of the reason for that is that the US government, Congress, decided basically 100 years ago that the government was going to subsidize roadways and it was not going to subsidize railroads. So even when it is more economically efficient and has a smaller impact on the environment and on our country in general, to move things by freight, we're actually spending taxpayer dollars to incentivize moving those things in 18-wheelers. And at the same time, we're not providing the dollars that would allow us to rebuild those freight lines in a way that they aren't harming people's lives in these communities that have been suffering from those trains for a century or more.
Yeah, and I'll say too, even with rails, it's the investment in commuter rail, when you look at the East Coast of this country, so you have Amtrak, which everyone knows the Northeast Quarter for Amtrak is making buku bucks and is basically subsidizing the rest of the system. But even beyond that, it's the heavy commuter rail that is sometimes on freight rail line, that is sometimes on Amtrak's line, and that connectivity that allows, almost a mega region on the, even though that mega region is probably, half the size of like Texas, but you end up creating this mega region because of the ability to have this really great rail system that is available. So that's even that part too, that, but the bar for railroads, it's high, even for those commuter rails. And I know there has been more funding under the bipartisan infrastructure law for the corridor ID program to ID other opportunities for commuter, high-speed rail, intercity rail, and things of that nature, but it's nearly not enough.
So
Yeah.
if you both were given a very large, substantial budget, say like 500 million to improve transportation in a city, where would you guys start?
500 million. That
That's
gets you
not a
like,
large
that's
budget.
like,
Oh, really? Okay.
500 million gets you like maybe a neighborhood sidewalks.
Really? I clearly do not have any idea how much these
I mean,
transportation
I think you have to think about cities. You're talking about billions needed in investment for cities. Because the thing about it is, once you're talking about a transportation system, you can't separate transportation from the buried infrastructure. And I think that's a conversation we're not ready to have, particularly since there isn't a lot of federal funding available on that drinking water, wastewater side. There's like the financial programs available, but there's no federal grant money available for drinking water, wastewater, like you see on the transportation side. But when you go to open a road, it's everyone has to get in. We're only opening this road one time, and it's all in. And so even in Houston, there's this challenge of, well, who's leading the need for this reconstruction? Are we reconstructing it because we need to have a different function of this roadway? Or are we reconstructing it because the buried infrastructure needs to be replaced? And I think every city across this country has buried infrastructure that's well beyond its useful life. When we think about all of the water lines that broke over the last couple of years, it's an infrastructure problem. It's a buried infrastructure problem, and all of those things. But if someone were to give me a blank check, I think that there is a lot of opportunity. I think that in most cities, you could probably reduce about half the lanes right now available, and reallocate that space for transit, reallocate that space for green infrastructure, because we're all struggling. I think that as rainstorms become more intense across this nation, we are seeing the challenges. New York City is a great example of, I don't ever remember the subway system flooding like it does now. And I feel like every other rainstorm, the subway system is flooded. So really making that level of investment of, resiliency, looking at what some other countries have done to be more resilient. I think, walking infrastructure, there's a lot that can be done around that, biking infrastructure. So that would be my, kind of magic wand. I think there's a lot available. I think there are cities that I have worked in that I'm like salivating, to remove, the highways, because I think that you can deck over all you want. But at the end of the day, sometimes it is a true removal to reknit those those communities and the developable land that becomes available from removal. And it's not every city, so don't go around saying I'm anti-highway. But I think there are some highways that, could be removed. They don't serve the purpose. And particularly when in some cases, there are a lot of cities where you can see where there was supposed to be a highway system, but it was never completed. So I say, go and take out what you're going to do if you're never going to complete it. So go take it out and return that land back to developable land, turn it back to the people for cities. But $500 million, that's a drop in the bucket.
I would say one thing that I've thought a lot about recently on the transit side is oftentimes we tend to focus on the individual really big projects. And I think that's important in transit. When I look at, cities that have really transformed themselves to be transit-friendly cities, there's usually some big projects in there. You look at something like Vancouver, they built a couple of fully grade separated rail transit lines that are now the core of their system. And those projects are really easy to imagine in every city. I have no problem coming up with a list of those for Houston or anywhere else. I literally have it in the back of my book. But in a lot of ways, we also get distracted by that. And that often the thing that makes cities truly great and transportation systems truly great is a lot of little projects. And when I'm thinking on the transit side, for example, there's an awful lot of bus stops that don't have bus shelters. And I would love to do a program in which we simply say every bus stop in the city will have a bus shelter. Because in terms of the quality of riding on transit, that makes a huge difference. I would love to do a project in which every stop has better passenger information. So you know what the service is and you know when it's coming. I would love to do projects so that the bus operators, the people who actually keep that whole system running, have a better quality of life, which means very simple things like putting a restroom at the end of every bus route so that operator actually has access to a restroom, and maybe making some nice break areas and thinking about how to make that all work better. And it's also things like looking at a bus system and saying, where are buses getting stuck? Where are buses losing time? Where are they losing reliability? And doing dozens of little individual projects. Let's fix this intersection because this intersection is what's holding up buses here. And the sum total of those little projects is what really makes the system great. But part of what's holding us back there is actually institutional capacity. It is really easy to hire a consultant to design a $1 billion transit line for you. You draw that line on the map and you get the consultant in and you do it. It is way harder to do something where you do all of those little projects. You actually need the agency staff to define them and scope them. And that means you need a large enough agency staff. And to me, one of the biggest problems I see in transit all over the place and all transportation is we simply don't have enough staff supporting these projects. And that's really holding us back.
And I want to add something else. I think, oh, sorry. I do want to add this. I think the other part of this, if you gave me a check, I think the overall problem too with how we fund transportation projects is there is a lot of money available for the capital improvement. Everybody wants to be there for the groundbreaking. Everyone wants to be there for the ribbon cutting. Everyone wants the pictures for the coffee table. But on the operations and maintenance side, there's no funding. It is largely going to be locally funded. It is largely going to be user fee if you're talking about transit. And to me, I think that a huge missed opportunity is the ability to have funds available for the operations and maintenance side, for the salaries of the bus drivers. I know that Christof mentioned having bathrooms, and absolutely, that is a challenge all around, but also increasing the wages of bus drivers, because it is every transit agency across this nation is struggling to find bus operators. And largely it's because it's you should be able to have a wage, you should be able to have benefits that you can live comfortably in the city where you're working. And that is just not the case right now. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity to do that. But in raising the wages of bus drivers, bus operators, mechanics to maintain the system, it increases your operations and maintenance. And that is the first thing that is cut. And again, because there's no funding available for those type of things. I know that the federal government was considering the ability to use certain federal funds for operations and maintenance. But I think if I had a wand, I think that to me is also a key project, if you will, not necessarily capital in nature, but very important to the future of transportation.
So continuing with this idea of funding, I'm really interested to know that in a world that's very clearly driven by money, what are some of the economic benefits and investing interest that would go towards inclusive transportation, and how can businesses and governments leverage these opportunities?
I'll say on the economic side, there are so many studies on the economics of multimodal roads. I know the Complete Streets Coalition, they've done extenuating research on roads before and after a complete street was installed, in terms of the sales revenue of the different businesses. And so we do know that having biking infrastructure, having walking infrastructure, public transit does increase the sales revenue of businesses around those. And so even when you look at Houston, the Shepherd-Durham project is a really great project. And I know phase 1 is under construction. There are questions about phase 2, but even with phase 1 being under construction, the development is happening on top of it. The tourists can't even get the project built, and the development is coming because developers know that they literally just have arms of people that do research, and they know that people want walkable neighborhoods. People will pay a premium to live where they can get to a grocery store, where they can get to a convenience store, where they can get to restaurants, where they can get to all of the things that they need. And so, we see that even with that, you have the development coming. And I think that's, examples all across the nation. So I don't think that the business community always needs to be convinced. I don't think the development community always needs to be convinced. I think sometimes it's the governments that need to be convinced, particularly when, and I'll say, I think this is the fault of the industry, is that, we've trained people for the last several decades on what we call level of service, right? And so that is, volume of the roadway versus the capacity of the roadway. And so we've trained people for decades and decades and decades that we need to widen the road so that we can have more capacity so that people can move faster. And so now when you're saying, okay, I know we trained you on level of service, but now we want to reduce the capacity in order to have better flow. People are like, wait a minute, what? And so it's hard for people to conceptualize the inverse, that if we take away, or if we reallocate a lane for other uses, that traffic won't get worse. They don't believe us now. And I think that's just the challenge of our industry, of training people all this time, that we need to widen the roads for better traffic flow.
Yeah. No, I love that overall point about what are we trying to accomplish here? And I think one of the things we've often done wrong in thinking about transportation is that we think about it, we call it mobility, and we think it's about the moving, but really transportation is about the getting somewhere. And I think we need to measure that. We need to measure how much stuff do you have access to. And I really start my class with that idea that I think cities are one of the greatest ever human inventions, because what cities do is they bring people together. And when we bring people together, cool stuff happens. Business happens from people gathering, ideas happens, art happens, culture happens. We have much more enjoyable lives because we are around other people. And what a good transportation network does is it connects people together, and it connects people to all of those opportunities to do things in their lives. And that's ultimately that economic impact. If we build a good transportation system, we are linking more people to each other. And we know from all of human history that when we do that, better things will happen. But we need to measure that. It's not about how many cars go down the street. It's how many people have access to how much.
And I'll even add on to that too. We focus so much on one type of movement of people going through, and we haven't measured people getting across. We don't think about the street as building face to building face, of how people get from one side to the other, of the visual of one side to the other. And then I think even to Christof's point, the ability to just sit and be in the right of way, like heavens forbid you put a bench down so that people can sit and people can be. We don't do that. And I think that we have to reevaluate how we think about the street and what is the street supposed to do.
So I just want to switch the conversation a little bit and direct a question to Dr. Spieler. So your work with the Houston Metro Board has been really successful with bus network redesign in Houston that led to an increase in ridership. Would you mind walking us through what about this redesign made it really effective?
Essentially what we did is we created a new network that really focused on serving the Houston we have today, which is a multi-centric city. Before that, the network was funneling everybody into downtown, a lot of times on routes still based on 1920 streetcar routes that had simply evolved over time and never been comprehensively rethought. So that was one big focus. Another one was frequency, that what we heard over and over from transit riders, what we know from across the transit industry when we look at ridership is frequency matters. The difference between a bus that comes every 15 minutes or a bus that comes once an hour is the difference between transit being there when you need it to be there or transit, you having to plan your entire life around that transit. I have a choice of being 10 minutes late to this meeting or 50 minutes early. And so that was the other second one. And sadly, post-COVID, a lot of that frequency is actually not there anymore. Houston's bus network is not as good as it was 5 years ago, because a lot of that frequency, buses that used to run every 15 minutes are now running every 30 again. And then finally, we also focused on every day of the week. Because if you are going to depend on transit for all of your trips, you need to be able to get to a grocery store on a Sunday, not just get to work on Monday. And obviously, there's also somebody who needs to work at that grocery store on Sunday. We're not a 5-day-a-week, 9-to-5 society, and we need to be able to serve everyone with transit. And those things put together is where we got the more ridership, but also us being willing to ask the question of what would this network look like if we redesigned it from a clean sheet of paper, and political leadership that backed up that idea and said, we think we need this system to change. And we are willing to do that, even though we know it will have some impacts on people, that even if we make the vast majority of people's trips better, some people's trips will get worse. We'll work hard not to strand anyone, we'll do our best, but we know that there are some trade-offs in doing this, and we are willing to do this for that benefit. And that was the biggest ingredient when I look at cities that successfully redesigned their networks and got more ridership, or cities that spent several years in the process and ended up not accomplishing anything. It's that political leadership that really made the difference.
So, although the Houston Metro has obviously had significant improvements in the past few years, there's always room for further improvement to any type of bus network or transit network. So what additional steps now do you think should be taken to improve the Houston bus network?
So I'm very curious on Veronica's take on this as well. But I think first of all, we need more of that. Like, we do still need more frequency in places. I would definitely look at more late night service. That's still a gap. I think there are real infrastructure gaps. I mentioned quality of bus stops earlier, some of the transfer centers, like there are places we really need to just make that passenger environment significantly better. And then above all, we need to speed up the system. I think the biggest problem with today's Houston transit network is trips just take too long. And even when we're running the bus frequently, if it's frequent but slow, that is still meaning that people have long trips. And ultimately, we need some real capital projects for that. We need to get buses in our own lanes. We also need to deal with specific intersections that are real bottlenecks. I think our downtown streets don't operate particularly well, and we could do a lot better in a way that actually would make it better for car drivers, not just for transit riders. And we need to deal with some of those major reliability issues. That crossing on Westheimer, where you have freight trains in Highland Village, that's crossing the busiest bus route in Texas. And if you're waiting in Montrose and your bus isn't coming, that might be because of a train right there. If we had an over or underpass, we would fix that. So it's a lot of little things. It's a couple of big things. It's really thinking about it as a whole network and really measuring it in terms of how it makes things better for passengers. And yeah, there's a lot we could do, and we need the focus and we need the funding.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I think there's also a missed opportunity in this entire region. A lot of other regions have travel demand management plans, and it's really a holistic plan that looks at not just commuter, but just how do you move people when you have very high demand. And I don't think that's something we do well, even at a very just kind of basic level. And so if you look at the Texans, the Astros, the Rockets, everyone drives in, you know, from the outer places. They park in surface lots. They go to the event and then they leave after having consumed alcohol and they go home. But I think there's a huge opportunity to use commuter buses, to expand the time of commuter buses, to get people to all of these events, these high demand events. Even on the weekend, when you think about parades and all of that, there's so much opportunity for these high demand events to use the commuter system, the commuter routes that already exist, in order to help facilitate getting people there. And that's a very kind of small thing that already exists. And I think particularly as we prepare for the World Cup, which I think most cities in the United States haven't really wrapped their mind around. We're going to have people living in Houston for 3 weeks, right? This isn't like, the NCAA tournament where it's just a weekend. We're going to have people that are going to come from other countries and they're going to live here for 3 weeks in our city. And are we prepared to move them around? Because if they're all going to be driving, we just don't even have enough rental cars for all of that. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I think there's a lot of opportunity, even around inner city travel, between here in San Antonio, here in Austin, here in Dallas. And I know that we're supposed to be talking about cities, but I think there's really a lot of opportunity to move people between these cities without having a motor vehicle, and particularly moving them around. So that's what I think. Those are the things I think, just kind of low hanging fruit, in addition to what Christof mentioned.
Yeah, no, and I think you're absolutely right on the park and ride network. We have this amazing network that gets people to jobs in downtown, and something like half the people who live in the suburbs served by the park and rides and work downtown take the bus to work. But that's totally a 9-to-5 system. The off-peak service in the middle of the day in the evening is far worse than the peak service. There's no service at all on weekends. And it's a system designed only for getting people to downtown. And there's actually jobs at the outer ends of the system in places like the energy corridor, but the network isn't designed to get you there. It's not designed to be easy to understand to get you there. And it's also not designed as a way to link local bus riders. I've talked to a bunch of local bus riders who are catching a bus at a park and ride that would have express service to downtown, but instead they're riding a local bus that could take them 20 minutes, 30 minutes longer, because the local bus is a lower fare than the park and ride bus. And meanwhile, that park and ride bus is taking off with empty seats on board. Like, that's not serving the agency, that's not serving the riders. If we really took advantage of this regional express bus infrastructure we had to serve more than just downtown commutes, I think we could make the whole network a lot better.
Absolutely. I think, even let's talk about the zoo. There's so many videos on Grizzly's Hood News of like people fighting over parking spaces on the weekend at the zoo. And so you have this really great regional amenity that everyone's driving to, and there is, transit there, right? There is a transit stop, but it's not by the zoo. So I think it's all these opportunities of getting people, just even in our region, to places they want to go at the times they want to go, and helping reduce stress overall. But then, to Christof's point, the cost then comes in of how do you price it, so that that people who are lower income, for people who are dependent on transit, are still able to access this really great amenity.
And one more thing I throw in is it's not just about the transportation network, it's about the destinations. We need more development next to transit because that lets more people live next to transit. But we also need to think about that for retail. We need to think about it for public facilities. Like, when HCC builds a new campus, they shouldn't be building it out in the middle of nowhere where Metro has to extend a once-an-hour bus out to meet the campus. They should be building that campus in a place that's already a transit hub, that's already well connected. So the most possible people have the opportunity to access that. And every time we build a public facility, we ought to be thinking about it. Where do we put it in the most connected places? How do we serve the most people? This is land use, not just transportation, we need to get right.
Well, and every time we build a public facility, we should be thinking of how many can we layer on one. I think, to have a recreation, facility separate from a library, separate from a school, and they're all in the same area. That is a lot of wasted land owned by the government, right? And I get the school districts aren't part of the city, but it's a lot of government owned and controlled land that is not its highest and best use. What I have seen in other cities, and I will say, DC, to its credit, largely because it's a landlocked city, has to start thinking about these things. And so they have co-located libraries with recreation facilities. They've co-located fire departments with recreation facilities and apartment buildings. And I think that's even like it's mind-boggling for people. Or even I know that there's one place in DC where they have a fire station underneath a hotel. And so I think that we have to think about, particularly when it's publicly owned land, think about how we can use that land to have as many destinations as possible, so that then when you layer transit on it, you are getting people to several things in one breath.
Thank you for all these great points. Jadyn and I truly learned so much in this conversation. We'll just like to ask, is there anything else that you both would like to cover that you think that we haven't touched on yet?
Oh my goodness. I'll say this. I am worried about the future of transportation, but I'm also hopeful about the future of transportation. My worry is there is a kind of, I'd say, miseducation campaign that has taken very technical terms and misusing them or misrepresenting their impact. And so you see this in cities across the United States. You see this in states where laws are being created to prevent road diets, as you will. I know that Florida just passed something that made it, pretty much impossible to ever reallocate space on the roadway for other uses. And so I think that there's that's happening. But I'm also very hopeful. I've seen what has happened in LA, where they just passed the people just passed a referendum to fund transit, to fund walking and biking through organizing. And so you've seen that in other places as well. And I think with the bipartisan infrastructure law, as those projects start going under construction, to be able to really see the impact of federal investment in areas of persistent poverty, I'm excited to see in kind of 3 to 5 years, as those projects wrap up, of the impact in those communities. And I hope that under this new transportation reauthorization bill, we're able to extend many of these programs. Christof mentioned railroads. The Railroad Crossing Elimination Program is a brand new program under the bipartisan infrastructure law that many of us advocated for. And so I hope that program continues. And so I'm hopeful for the future, but also very cautious of things swinging in the other direction. But I remain hopeful.
Yeah. And my final thought would be that these are not conversations for only transportation people to be having. That ultimately, when we make decisions about transportation, we're making decisions about what kind of city we want to live in, and everybody ought to be part of those conversations. So I hope that everybody thinks about transportation. I hope that everybody takes those opportunities to have their voice be heard, organizes their community, shows up to those public meetings, speaks to their elected officials, and basically demands better.
Thank you so much for being on here today.
Thank you for having us.
Before we go, I wanted to take a moment to tell you about an exciting thing that's happening in town this week, and that's an art exhibit called Resilience Rising: Navigating Earth's Challenges. It's a thought-provoking art exhibition that delves into the urgent need for awareness and preparedness in the face of environmental risks, and it's been funded in part by the City of Houston through the Houston Arts Alliance. And so this piece really reflects on a range of environmental issues and wants to spark dialogue around the profound impact that environmental justice challenges, climate-related challenges, food insecurity have on both our planet and our communities, and also highlighting the really incredible work that local communities are doing to try and overcome some of these issues. So there are immersive installations, visual artworks, and interactive experiences, and should be really thought-provoking and engaging, supported by the city. And it's going to be happening at the Julia Hester Community Center. And that's all week this week. So it starts up on Monday. It's every day from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. You can learn more on the City of Houston's calendar. The event is called Resilience Rising: Navigating Earth's Challenges. And if you go and Google that, you'll learn all about it. And I really encourage you to get out and go this week if you can make it. Before we conclude, I want to remind you that KPFT Houston is currently in our February fund drive. As public radio, KPFT Houston can only exist with your support. Over 90% of our funding comes from listeners like you. If you're enjoying Gulf Streams and want to support our work, please call 713-526-KPFT and pledge a donation. You can make a one-time donation or become a monthly sustainer to support our work. In the coming weeks, we'll talk about urban planning, carbon capture and storage, and new environmental initiatives happening around town. If you want to become a station sustainer, ask about our memory bricks, permanent inscribed tributes to your generosity here at the studio. Call 713-526-KPFT to learn about all the unique pledge drive offerings going on this month. We're delighted to bring you important conversations about environmental and climate issues here in Houston and beyond on Gulf Streams, and can only do so with your support. So please, call 713-526-KPFT, make a one-time or sustainer donation, mention Gulf Streams, and help us keep ad-free public radio on the air here in Houston.
Up next time on Gulf Streams, we're talking about environmental research institutes in Houston. If you have any questions or ideas for what you'd like featured on Gulf Streams, leave a voicemail at 713-348-4081 or email us at westont@rice.edu. A quick reminder that you can catch up on all Gulfstream episodes anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski, co-produced by Joseph Campana, audio engineer Rico Henrique, research support provided by Jadyn Bray-Boyce and Sienna Yiin. Stay tuned for the R&R show with Ronnie Renfro and Tom Richards here on KPFT, Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.